Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I'm happy to welcome you to a presentation on We Stood Our Ground, how Lexington transformed from a peaceful farming community to a hotbed of revolution. We extend a warm welcome to our fellow veterans who are viewing this program from the Edith Norse Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital in nearby Bedford, Massachusetts. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Alex Cain. In 1765, the peaceful village of Lexington was horrified when riots broke out in Boston. Yet, within just a few years, the residents became convinced that revolution was inevitable. And they became passionate supporters of the revolution. Lexington had become one of the most radical towns in Massachusetts and was openly preparing for rebellion against the British. How did this change come about? One man, according to our speaker, was responsible for much of this radicalization, the Reverend Jonas Clarke. Alex Cain has had dual careers in law and education, while also studying history and writing books. A graduate of Merrimack College and New England School of Law, he practiced law for 10 years, and he taught criminal justice, political science, and American history at several colleges in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. He is now academic dean for the Computer Systems Institute, which helps international students acquire the skills and the certification they need to earn degrees at American schools. He joined the Lexington Minutemen at the age of 18, and he has become the company's go-to historian. He works with Minuteman National Historic Park to help assure the accuracy of their presentations, and he also has been a Civil War reenactor, and he formed McAlpin's Corps, who are reenactors of civilian American loyalist refugees. So, with that background, I know you're going to enjoy what he has to say. Please welcome Alex Cain. Take it away, Alex.
Hi, thank you so much, Linda. First of all, before I share my screen, I do want to stress how much of it is an honor to be speaking to this organization. I know in the past I've had the occasion to interact with this group, and it really is a humbling experience. I get to do what I do because of the sacrifices all of you made. So thank you very much before I start for the true privilege of speaking with this group. So when your organization asked me to speak, one of the first things they wanted me to talk about, or the primary thing, was about Lexington. And many of the things about the Battle of Lexington, as well as the events leading up to the battle, are relatively unknown. There is this common myth that basically farmers almost spontaneously picked up their muskets and went to encounter the British when they were when the British left Boston on April 18, 1775. There's also this myth that unfortunately exists that the Lexington Militia was woefully unprepared for war and woefully unprepared for the coming political revolution that accompanied 1775 and onward. I've spent probably the last decade and a half researching Lexington's role in the American Revolution, and more importantly, Lexington's role on the events leading up to April 19th, 1775, and the day itself. And you would absolutely be amazed at what I have uncovered over the last decade, just looking at the various aspects. And I'm thrilled today to share with you some of my findings. And my screen is frozen. There we go. So what we are going to discuss today, first of all, I would like to at least give everyone here an understanding of the physical layout of Lexington around the Lexington Common. What did the area look like in 1775? We're also going to be talking about the social setting of Lexington, because that is very, very important to understand how this town went from a peaceful farming community to probably one of the most, if not the most radical towns on the eve of the American Revolution. I will be talking, as Linda had referenced, the role of the Reverend Jonas Clarke and his influence over the citizens of Lexington. I will also be talking about the political evolution of the town from 1765 with the Stamp Act crisis, leading right up to the eve of war. I will get into the military buildup and some of the misconceptions that actually existed with the town of Lexington. And then finally, I will talk about the overview of the events of April 19th, and I at least will give you a taste of the civilian impact of the battles of Lexington and Concord on the civilian population of Lexington. So as a introduction, I have always been told that when I am going to be speaking, it is very important that I at least share with my guests some important quote or some inspiring words to get everybody in the mood for this particular lecture. And in this particular case, I'm sorry, I am very sarcastic. So I came up with this super important quote from some expert I've never heard of. That's my quote, and that's my joke for the day. I do apologize. It's a bad one. So let us start first with the physical outline of the Lexington, what is now downtown Lexington, the area of the battle. This is a map that was drawn in the early 19th century, and it gives a general overview of what the village of Lexington between the border, between Monroe Tavern up to the Lexington Common would have looked like on April 19th, 1775. At the top of the screen, you can see what looks like a triangle area up here where it says the Common. That was the village common. This was the centerpiece of the town of Lexington, as it is today. This is where town meetings took place. This is where the militia drilled. This was a place also where cattle could be brought to actually graze if they could not do so on their own farms. Around the Common, you had a variety of structures ranging from Buckman Tavern to the meeting house, to an alarm bell, to a well as well, a water well. There also would have been homes surrounding this area. There was at least 5 to 6 residents that surrounded the Lexington Common at that time. If you were moving eastward along the Massachusetts Bay Road, that is what Massachusetts Avenue is known as today. Back then it was known as the Bay Road. You would have passed over Vine Brook, and then you would have come to a second cluster of homes. These second cluster of homes are basically located near the Lexington Police Department today. You would have found the Estabrook family, their residence within the vicinity of this second cluster. The Estabrook family was, if not the wealthiest, it was one of the wealthiest families in Lexington at the time. If you would then follow down along the road to Woburn, you would have found another cluster, which was known in the 18th century as New Scotland. New Scotland is where many of the Monroe family had settled, and a lot of the Scottish immigrants who came over here in the 1730s and 1740s eventually took up residence along the Woburn line. Down near the Monroe Tavern at the bottom of the picture is where you would have found the fourth cluster. The fourth cluster of homes seemed to center around Monroe Tavern. Monroe Tavern, unlike Buckman Tavern, was more of the centerpiece of 18th century Lexington. There is evidence that Mr. Monroe was not only running a tavern and basically a bed and breakfast for his guests who wanted to stay the night, but he also apparently had a merchant shop where he would be selling goods from Boston as well as Newburyport and Salem in his tavern also. There appears to be a fifth cluster that would have been located up towards, heading towards Concord. What I found with those clusters, the homes tended to be more interdispersed. So if the British soldiers were coming into Lexington on April 19th, 1775, as they approached the Monroe Tavern cluster, this is the structure that they would have seen at that time. This is Monroe Tavern. Monroe Tavern ultimately would have ended up as a field hospital for the retreating British regulars in the afternoon of April 19th. Continuing up the road, if they decided, if they looked over once they hit the Lexington Green, if they looked over diagonally to their right, they would have seen probably about a half-mile away the Reverend Jonas Clarke's homestead. This is his residence. It is currently owned by the Lexington Historical Society. Granted, today in the 21st century, with all the modern buildings, you cannot see this house from the green. But in April 19, 1775, due to deforestation as well as open farmlands, this home would have had a clear view of the Lexington Common and would be considered a witness house to the events that took place on that particular day. In addition to that, you would have also seen the Buckman Tavern. The Buckman Tavern was the assembly point of the Lexington Militia on April 18th, 1775, and also served as a rally point the next morning on April 19th, 1775. We do believe, unlike the Monroe Tavern, the Buckman Tavern, because of its central location, was more likely where the political meetings would take place as well, where there would be meetings of importance, where the town's committee of correspondence would have met, where local farmers would have gotten together and discussed the news and events that were coming out of Boston. Finally, what is not seen today on the green, but this particular structure, which I'll discuss in just a second, there was a massive meeting house that was located at the very tip of the Lexington Common at the intersection of Massachusetts Ave and Bedford Road. This meeting house served multiple purposes. First of all, it served for town meetings. Secondly, it served as a church. A common misperception of 18th and early 19th century New England cultures was that there was a church that was always separate from the meeting house, or the New England colonists had a meeting house and then located maybe a few hundred yards away would have been the church. In 18th century Lexington, as well as throughout New England, meeting houses and churches were one and the same thing. This particular meeting house that I have in this image is from Amesbury, Massachusetts. It still stands today. It was built in 1785. It is known as the Rocky Hill Meeting House, which was a particular section of Amesbury. The Rocky Hill Meeting House is about the closest thing you are going to get to what the meeting house in Lexington looked like on April 19th, 1775. So with the physical structure in mind, let's talk about what the economic profile of Lexington is. Today, if you drive into Lexington, I'm going to be nice. I live up in the Merrimack Valley. I live in Merrimack, Massachusetts, which is a small farming community. But if you go into Lexington now, admittedly, everything is expensive. The food is expensive. The homes are expensive. I think even parking is expensive. That is not what Lexington was in the 18th century. In the 18th century, first of all, Lexington society, although it was fluid, it's not as mobile as you think in modern society. Residents of Lexington, like most New Englanders, believed that the upper order of society were to rule, while the lower class was expected to obey. So if you had somebody like the Estabrook family, they would be considered, or the Parker family from Lexington, they would be considered the town leaders. Why, by comparison, you may have the Blodgett family, which was one of the lower class families in Lexington. There might be some opportunities for them to move up the social ladder, but they were severely limited and they were expected to remain in their place. Often lower citizens were viewed with contempt in Lexington and disdain if they attempted to assert influence or power beyond that was expected of their station. And it was not uncommon in the 18th century Lexington for people to be put back in their place if they sort of acted outside their social expectations. I have seen multiple court documents of individuals being prosecuted in Middlesex County courts in the 18th and 19th century, including individuals from Lexington, for what is considered improper behavior. And as I indicated, leaders of the town were expected to be men of distinction, respected by all. And by 18th century standards, if you sort of did away with this hierarchical structure, not only would it result in disorder, chaos, and anarchy, but there was also a belief you were going to anger God because God wants this particular structure and this particular political order to take place within a society, including Lexington. So when we look at what was the town like, I had indicated a few moments ago that Lexington today is somewhat expensive. Well, back in the 1770s, Lexington was a relatively poor town. The town had approximately 400 to 600 cows on the eve of the American Revolution. So this is a dairy community. Lexington is known predominantly for its dairy products. In 1771, there were 185 males identified as being over the age of 16. In 1775, it was 208. The total population of the town in 1770 was 800 residents. That's including men, women, and children. So not only is this a poor town, it is an extremely small town as well when compared to Concord, Cambridge, Andover, Newburyport, Salem. And as I indicated, the overwhelming majority of families were involved in dairy farming, but there are other occupations that I've been able to identify. There were blacksmiths in town. There were wheelwrights, in other words, individuals who were making wagon wheels. I have just recently identified within the last 48 hours, I'm trying to confirm, a barrel maker or a cooper. There is a carpenter, and there was a clockmaker in town as well. Now, for farming, if you were a farmer, a dairy farmer, and this particular document is actually taken, or this chart is actually taken from the diary of the Reverend Jonas Clarke, and it outlines the daily routine of farmers in Lexington around 1770. From December to March, farmers are engaged in turning gardens and plowing and tilling their land. They're gathering winter's wood, manure, and ashes. They're harvesting ice, and they're slaughtering hogs. In the springtime, a Lexington farmer would be actually working in the fields, plowing, fertilizing, sowing, and weeding. They would also be milking cows, as I indicated, because they're a dairy town, making cheese. They would also be working on maintenance on their home and making soap also. In the summer, that is the time for hay and grain harvesting. The women and the men would actually participate in laundry and household cleaning. There would also be cooking extra meals for perhaps hired hands or hired help. And of course, Lexington, in addition to being a dairy community, also had multiple apple orchards in the area as well. And so there would be harvesting of fruit, vegetables, root crop, and squashes, canning the harvest for winter food, and of course, making alcohol, making apple cider, as well as apple molasses, vinegar, and apple sauces. I would be remiss if I didn't at least pass on this fun fact. Today, the average American consumes roughly 2 to 2.5 gallons of pure alcohol a year. That's just a thimbleful of beer, a thimbleful of pure alcohol in a beer you may consume. By comparison, the average Lexington resident in the 1780s consumed 5 to 6 gallons of pure alcohol per year. Of course, the sad thing is when you have a sort of impoverished community, often you have a town that is in debt as well. And I found that on the eve of the American Revolution, Lexington residents were being crushed by financial debt. In 1759, 15% of Lexington men saw a forced sale of either all or part of their real estate to settle due to debts that were owed at the time of their death. By 1779, that percentage had risen almost 29%. So if an individual passed away and he had debt over his head, Before the family could even try and get their hands on an inheritance, there were forced sales where creditors were actually coming in and actually taking that money away from the family. By the end of the American Revolution, 40% of Lexington estates are facing forced sales. So at the time of their death at the end of the American Revolution, 40% of Lexington residents are in massive debt. By 1774, 1/3 of Lexington residents are landless. And on top of that, we had impoverished poor in the town who were relying upon basically pre-American government welfare systems. They were turning to the town for financial support. In 1764, there were 12 individuals who were depending upon the town for financial support. And by 1775, the number had doubled to 24. And of course, also, which was actually very common in New England, but I found also a very high rate in Lexington as well, teenage pregnancy. So these are all the common factors that you might see in an impoverished town today. You're seeing it in Lexington on the eve of the American Revolution. In the 1740s, 19% of all first births in New England, including Lexington, were prenuptial conceptions. So 19% of all first births were born out of wedlock. From the 1740s onward, births less than 9 months after marriage steadily increased. So there was an increase in the pregnancies at the time of marriage, that the bride was actually pregnant when she was getting married. By 1774, 41% of all firstborn children, including those in Lexington, were conceived out of wedlock. Now, what it generally was is the bride would find out, or the woman would find out that she was pregnant, and then there'd be a very quick wedding afterwards, the classic shotgun wedding, and then the child would be born, shortly thereafter. So when we look at the outlook, or we look at the conditions of Lexington, you can see that they are saddled with debt. There's a high rate of teenage pregnancy. There's this small dairy community. And then arrives this gentleman in the late 1750s. Up until the 1750s, the town of Lexington had a minister that was known as the Reverend Hancock. The Reverend Hancock was a cousin of John Hancock. And in the late 1750s, he decided to retire. In the tradition of 18th century New England towns, the towns would actually interview potential candidates from Harvard or from other communities who had a younger minister who was looking to move to another community. Other times they would actually put out advertisements and try to solicit ministers. In this particular case, the Reverend Jonas Clarke came to Lexington and intended to wow them almost immediately. He was young, he was energetic, and he had a way about preaching and a way of interacting with the community that the residents of Lexington were just instinctively drawn to him. He got to the point that he knew just about every individual in the community personally. If there were incidents where neighbors were disputing, he would act as the intermediary and go in and actually resolve the dispute. For those wild teenagers who not only were getting pregnant before wedlock, but there were also occasions where they were, not surprisingly, shall we say, partying in the woods or having parties outside of their parents' supervision, the Reverend Jonas Clarke would intervene and try to straighten them out. So he almost became a father figure to the town, and he almost became this great spiritual leader. So with that in mind, what basically happened is on the eve of the American Revolution, Jonas Clarke became the political figure and the religious leader of the town. He is the individual who would help shape Lexington's politics. He is the individual who would help shape the town on how they would respond to different political crises. He is the individual who served as the guide and the foundation for Lexington's political stance throughout the 1760s leading up to the American Revolution. And he became so popular that other ministers in other communities began to turn for him for guidance, and they tried to imitate him. Clarke was actually invited to different communities, including Boston, Lincoln, Concord, Salem, and Newburyport, to speak about the political crisis and how they should prepare for it. And so this particular individual, the Reverend Jonas Clarke, and his fellow ministers who were influenced by him, actually got the attention of the British Army. And Lord Hugh Earl Percy, who was a commander of a brigade, he was a brigadier general, wrote to the Duke of Northumberland on July 27, 1774, when he said, "I am sorry to say that no body of men in this province are so extremely injurious to the peace and tranquility of it as the clergy. They preach sedition openly from their pulpits. Nay, some of them have gone so far as absolutely to refuse the sacrament to the communicants till they have signed a paper of the most seditious kind, which they have denominated the Solemn League and Covenant. So much with respect to the inhabitants." So this is what is going on with the Reverend Jonas Clarke. He has actually come into Lexington, and he is now taking the helm where he is leading the town on how to respond to the growing political crisis that is evolving in Boston between the colony of Massachusetts and England. And so here are a sample of some of the sermons that the Reverend Clarke was preaching from the pulpit in Lexington, as well as in other locations throughout the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The importance of military skill, measures for defense, a martial spirit in the time of peace, the fate of blood. Each of these four sermons that the Reverend Clarke gave either in Lexington or in Boston or Salem basically were all preaching that it was considered a sin if you do not prepare militarily for war with England. England is violating our rights. They are engaging in sinful behavior. And God commands that we as Massachusetts colonists must rise up and fight the British colony, the British government. And if you do not, you are sinning. So here's a couple of samples of some of the sermons that he did. And these actually translated into political writings of the time. So what would happen is the Reverend Clarke would preach from the pulpit about the evils of the British government or British government policy. And then he would turn around and meet with the Lexington committees of correspondence and tell them how to write responses to Boston. So on the Stamp Act crisis, on October 21st, 1765, the Reverend Clarke instructed William Reed, who was the Lexington representative to the Massachusetts legislature, that you need to convey that the Stamp Act crisis is a door to numberless evils, which only time can discover. When it came to the Quartering Act, again, the Reverend Clarke wrote the response from Lexington. And in that response, he indicated that he felt that the Quartering Act was an infringement of their natural, constitutional, and chartered rights. So here he is on behalf of Lexington, speaking to them and saying, hey, England, you're thinking about placing troops in our homes. You are violating our constitutional and charter rights. Charter rights refers to the Magna Charta, as well as various political documents and legal documents that came out during the Glorious Revolution as well. When it came to supporters of the tea tax, the Reverend Clarke's instructions to the Committee of Correspondence, which they adopted, was if there is anyone in my town that is supporting the tea tax, they should be looked upon as an enemy of the town and should be treated with neglect and contempt. This is the spiritual leader of the town. This is a person who is supposed to be leading the town and is supposed to be telling the town. And showing almost like Christian-like behavior, that despite politics, I support you and I am here for you. But instead, what the Reverend Clarke is doing is basically saying, listen, if you support the tea tax, you should be looked at as an enemy as the town. And if a mob happens to visit you and treat you with neglect, oh well. And then finally, when it comes to the intolerable acts, this is where they closed the Boston port and they shut down and dissolved the Massachusetts government. The Reverend Clarke drafted a response for the Lexington Committee of Correspondence and stated, we shall be ready to sacrifice our estates and everything dear in life, yea, in life itself, in support of the common cause. So again, now we're at the point where Lexington, under the leadership of the Reverend Clarke, is actually, by 1773, openly arguing, we will fight you militarily if necessary, and we are willing to sacrifice our life and our estates in order to protect our constitutional rights as English colonists. And of course, now if we take a look with the Reverend Clarke's influence, if we start breaking down some of the actual political crisis and see how Lexington responded, you can actually see an evolution from what was initially a moderate tempered response to the eve of the American Revolution. They become fairly radical. So dealing first with the Stamp Act crisis, the Stamp Act crisis was basically, the British government had run out of money. The French Indian War had essentially drained their bank accounts to the point where they owed millions and millions of pounds in debt. So as a result, the British government decided, why don't we tax the British colonies who benefited from our military effort to drive the French out, and the colonists should pay for it. And one of the taxes they came up with was a Stamp Act. And basically, this was going to be a tax on all legal documents, gaming documents, as well as religious documents, ceremonial documents, as well as also a tax on the tax itself they had. Well, when this came out, Bostonians were absolutely horrified, as was Massachusetts colony throughout the entire area. The difference is, in Boston, they resorted to mob violence to deal with the Stamp Act crisis. They threatened stamp collectors, they burned down houses, Boston devolved into mob rule. You saw similar behavior in Salem and Newburyport, as well as Newport, Rhode Island. But when you start going into the interior, this little dairy community of Lexington, they were horrified, one, by the Stamp Act tax, but they were even more horrified by the mob violence. So while the Reverend Clarke was sort of guiding them on how to respond, initially they took a very level-headed, calm response to the Stamp Act crisis, and instead of mob violence, they encouraged, listen, let's try and resolve this politically or through negotiation. And so the Stamp Act crisis, the town voted at a town meeting that we earnestly recommend to William Reed, who again is the representative from Lexington in the Massachusetts legislature, the most calm, decent, and dispassionate measures for our open, explicit, and resolute assertion and vindication of our charter rights and liberties. They are basically saying, listen, whoa, that mob violence in Boston, that's not us. Let's come up with a calm, rational way to resolve this. So when you go further into the Stamp Act, is they start, again, they're saying let's take a calm approach. But the Reverend Clarke wanted to make sure that the residents were also asserting their political and civil and constitutional rights as well. So even though they took a Stamp Act, they took a calm approach to the Stamp Act, they did stress, listen, let's be sure that, our charter rights and privileges, our English liberties are protected because we are free and natural subjects of the crown. It would continue with their response to the Stamp Act. Again, they take a moderate approach by saying, we humbly conceive this act. It violates our rights and privileges. Nowhere in this statement, and I will let you read it as I talk here, nowhere in this statement do they talk about armed rebellion. Nowhere do they talk about resistance. Instead, what they are saying is we humbly, point out, we want a calm, dispassionate response. We recognize our sovereign leader and parliament, have granted us this rights, and please protect our rights, because we are His Majesty's subjects. So when you take a look at this response, they continue on talking about, again, and you can see the influence of the Reverend Jonas Clarke, how we have the risk of losing our rights. But again, it is a very calm, even petition in light of what you see in Boston. But when you jump forward a few years later to 1768, in 1768, the British government, because what happened is, as a result of all the protests in Massachusetts, as well as New York and the southern colonies, Parliament rescinded the Stamp Act. They realized it was bad financial policy, and we really, maybe we shouldn't have passed it. But they did pass a resolution saying, but we still got this debt. We'll be back American colonies. At some point later, we reserve the right to pass other financial taxes, and we're going to hit you with them. And in 1768, they did. They passed the Townshend duties, which covered taxes on glass, taxes on imports, taxes on clothing, again, taxes on documents, taxes on gunpowder, taxes on rum. So they were very angered on the alcohol. This is where you start seeing the radicalization. The Reverend Clarke, keep in mind, he came into town by about 1758, 1759. So when the tax crisis of the Stamp Act came, it was 1765. He had only been in the town for about 5 or 6 years. Now we're at the point he's been in town for almost a decade. And he's constantly preaching from the pulpit the evils of the British government. He is preaching from the pulpit how, war could be coming. You need to be militarily prepared for potential war with the crown. So you wanted to take a look when you start seeing by 1768 this change in approach that moves away from let's take a calm and reasoned approach to let's start seeing let's start asserting our rights. And this is where they openly start arguing potential resistance. On the Townshend duties, Lexington's response under the guidance of the Reverend William Clarke, that the freeholders and other inhabitants of the town of Lexington will, at the utmost peril of their lives and fortunes, take all legal and constitutional measures to defend and maintain your person, family, crown, dignity of our said sovereign lord, George III, and all in singular the rights, liberties, privileges, and immunities granted in the royal charter, as well as those declared to be belonging to us as British subjects by birthright, as all others therein specially mentioned. In 1768, to September 21st, the town of Lexington at its town meeting passed this resolution under the leadership of the Reverend Jonas Clarke. They outright said, I can't find any other town in the colony. In 1768, Concord is still sort of arguing, let's take peaceful measures. Newburyport, let's take peaceful measures. Andover, Salem are all saying, guys, let's see if we can work this out. Let's see if we can do something else. Even Boston really isn't at this point, and Boston has all the mob violence. In 3 years, Lexington is now at the forefront, or starting to emerge at the forefront, where they are saying the British government is passing policies, they are trying to revoke our charter rights, they are infringing upon our constitutional rights, and we are willing to sacrifice our lives and our personal estates and fortune to defend our constitutional rights. So be it. This is in 1768. This is before the Boston Massacre. This is before the Boston Tea Party. Lexington is out in the forefront, starting to become a radical town. By 1772, Lexington is the radical town. The Reverend Clarke is now being invited to other communities. He is being invited to speak. His writings are being published, and he is at the forefront of Lexington political policy. And it becomes in December 31st, December 31st, 1772. The Reverend Clarke in the town of Lexington has now passed a resolution saying it is time to prepare for war. It is the natural right and duty of every man to consult their own safety and to take measures for the preservation of their own liberty and property, without which life can be scarcely deemed worth possessing. Under the guidance in 1772, Lexington is now gone from, hey, we're going to defend our constitutional rights within all our needs, to by 1772 starting to openly say, we're going to take measures to preserve our liberty and property and our safety. The fact that they're referencing their own safety is a nod to a military preparation. And this is Lexington in 1772. Other towns are now starting to catch up to Lexington, but again, Lexington is at the radical forefront of resistance to British policy. And of course, that leads us to December of 1773. And what should be known as a forefront is in December of 1773, there was this little incident in Boston where a bunch of individuals got together, those wild Boston mobs, and tossed tea into Boston Harbor. What many people don't realize, however, is that 3 days prior to the Boston Tea Party, Lexington gathered all the tea in its town and burned it. So Lexington was actually even before ahead of the Boston Tea Party. And here we have their statement. At this point, they are now referring to British politicians and Parliament, not the Crown, but Parliament, as enemies of the rights and liberty of Americans. And that there is a belief now by 1773 that Parliament intends to enslave and destroy the colonists. And they believe this wicked plan will be the badge of their slavery, and it will certainly become their ruin. In short, what was happening by 1770, and I just talked about that already, was by 1773, Lexington, as well as Massachusetts, throughout the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony, as well as New England, were firmly under the belief that England was trying to provoke war with her colonies. They looked at Ireland and they looked at India. So they looked at Ireland and India. And their belief was that, listen, those two countries were conquered. You know, they sort of provoked those two countries into a rebellion, and they moved in and just conquered them and enslaved them. They were convinced, the New Englanders were convinced that because of British policy, they were trying to provoke the Americans into resisting, to the point that they would almost openly rebel. And then in turn, England would then have the justification to send in its army and then launch the army against the colonists, conquer them, and turn them into slaves, and thereby revoking all their rights as Englishmen. That was the perception. And even Lexington indicated that on January 5th, 1773. Our charter rights and liberty are in danger, are infringed upon by the most careful, serious, and mature consideration of them. They then go on, they indicated that how the heads of government have been blinded, the sources of justice poisoned, and the hands of administration bribed with interest. The system of slavery will soon be complete. So as a result, what does Lexington do? When now they're thinking by 1773, we're going to war. They're going to try and make us slaves. And this is where husbands are looking at their family saying, oh my God, are my children going to become slaves? You know, wives are like, my husband could be taken away from me. So what's her response? Lexington starts preparing for war, and they actually do. So the military buildup for Lexington, I can actually document it, begins in 1774. At this point, they pretty much say, that's it. They are coming. There is war coming. England is going to provoke it. We don't know when it is, but we are going to prepare for it. So what we should start off with is, first of all, what was the Lexington Militia? What were they known as? First of all, there is a common myth out there that the Lexington Militia was known as the Lexington Minutemen. In fact, there is a modern historical organization I belong to that is known as the Lexington Minutemen. Unfortunately, in the 18th century, in 1774 and 1775, the Lexington Minutemen did not exist. There is no evidence that the town of Lexington actually created a Minuteman company. We may never know, because unfortunately the town records from 1775 were stolen many years ago. And so as a result, we do not know. But what we do know, looking at the surviving town records that were still there, as well as depositions from the battles of Lexington and Concord, the men and officers of the Lexington Militia referred to themselves as one of two names. They called themselves either the Lexington Training Band, which is an old English style reference for a company of militia, or they called themselves Captain John Parker's Company of Militia. So who were the officers of this company? Well, first of all, you had Captain John Parker, the gentleman whose statue is up on the common. Directly underneath him was Lieutenant William Tidd, Ensign Robert Monroe. Of the officers, Ensign Monroe is one of the few individuals who actually had experience fighting in the French and Indian War. A popular belief is that Captain John Parker was a French and Indian War veteran. The evidence I have found is actually quite to the contrary. He did not fight during the French and Indian War. You had Ensign Joseph Simons as well. And finally, you had a clerk, Daniel Harrington. On top of that, the non-commissioned officers of the Lexington Militia, Sergeant William Monroe, the tavern owner. You had a Sergeant Francis Brown, who after Parker's death later in the year would become commander of the Lexington Militia, Sergeant Ebenezer White, Corporal Joel Viles, Corporal Samuel Sanderson, Corporal John Monroe, and Corporal Ebenezer Parker. We were able to identify 5 individuals who were enslaved people who served with the Lexington Militia in 1775. The most famous of them is Prince Estabrook, who was wounded at the Battle of Lexington. But we also know that Pompey Blackman, Samuel Crafts, Jupiter Tree, and Cato Tudor were also enslaved black men who were serving within the Lexington Militia in 1775. My research suggests that your average militia company on April 19th, 1775 had approximately 1 to 5 enslaved men in their ranks. So for those units that actually mobilized for the battles of Lexington and Concord, my estimates are this could be as low as 500 to about 700 enslaved people who were fighting on April 19th, 1775. So was Lexington preparing for war? As I started to indicate, a full month before the Massachusetts Provincial Congress started ordering its residents to reorganize its militia system, get rid of the loyalists in the units, and create Minuteman companies, Lexington was already on full wartime preparation. According to the Reverend Clarke, the Lexington Militia was already training, preparing for war as early as September 15th, 1774. On September 26, 1774, Lexington voted to provide a pair of drums for the use of the military company in its town. Lexington actually had 2 drummers, not one. They had 2 drummers. One of them was William Diamond. The other one, I think, may have been Solomon Brown. Finally, on November 3rd, 1774, the town voted to adopt the British 1764 Crown Manual exercise as its military discipline and to put themselves in a position of defense against their enemies. That means on November 3rd, 1774, the town of Lexington voted to adopt the same manual of arms and same drill maneuvers and same military tactics as the British Army. They were using the same documents that a British soldier would be using as well. And of course, here is the order. On December 10th, 1774, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress said, listen, this is great that you guys are forming Minuteman companies. This is great that you guys are all drilling. But you know something? You are all woefully and poorly equipped. You guys need to get your Minuteman and militia companies, get their act together. You've got to make sure they have effective firearms, bayonets, a cartridge pouch, knapsack, blankets, canteens, and ammunition. Get on it, towns. So what does Lexington do in response? Lexington actually starts mobilizing. First thing is December 1764. Lexington passes a resolution saying, okay, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress just ordered us to start equipping our militia companies properly. We're going to strictly follow. It wasn't simply we're going to adhere to it. The town actually said we are going to strictly follow. And as a result, they formed a committee, including John Parker. And it appears John Parker may have been the leader of this particular committee. And they saw basically, and they were going to carry out the orders to ensure that the town was properly equipped. And what happened is, where do you get the equipment? Where do you get the firearms? Where do you get all this stuff? Local Lexington men were hired to make and supply the arms and equipment to the Lexington Militia, Captain Parker's company. So what you have here, of the individuals assigned to the committee was John Parker, captain of militia. And over the next several months, it appears that the committee, under the leadership of Parker, took the steps to ensure the company was properly armed and equipped. So as a result, several men from Lexington personally contributed to Lexington's war effort. So who were they? First of all, Jonathan Harrington Sr. He was the father of the company fifer. He was charged with making cartridge boxes, ammunition pouches, and belting for the militia. So every militiaman would have an ammunition pouch. Philip Russell was sort of the backup to Jonathan Harrington. He was also making cartridge boxes, but because he was a blacksmith, he was making bayonets for members of the Lexington militia. Jonas Parker, who I actually portray at the Battle of Lexington reenactment every year, was a carpenter by trade. He was taking fowling pieces, which were 18th century shotguns, cutting back the wood stocks so that barrels would be exposed and socket bayonets could be slid over the barrels. Nathan Simons was providing blankets to those Lexington militiamen who could not afford them. Jeremiah Harrington was making knapsacks for the militiamen as well. And then you had John Parker, the company captain. The evidence is very, very strong that he was making powder horns for the Lexington company. Even ammunition, you had two individuals, a Joshua Reed and Ensign Harrington, who were traveling throughout the colony to get their hands on gunpowder and lead for the militia. They ended up buying, in Waltham and Boston, 104 pounds of bullets for the Lexington militia. They did a second run. They got even more lead from Boston as well for bullets for the town militia. So were they successful in being fully armed and equipped? It's nice to say, hey, yeah, they, these guys tried to do it. But did they actually do it? The answer is a resounding yes. These are the items that the Massachusetts Provincial Congress indicated town militia should have if they go to war. Firearm, bayonet, cartridge box, knapsack, ammunition, blanket, canteen. Based upon my research, this is what Lexington actually carried. Firearm, bayonet, cartridge box, powder horn, knapsack, ammunition, blanket, canteen, and the Lexington militia also acquired 2 cannons. That's another story for another time, but Lexington had 2 iron field pieces. They did not see action on April 19th because they had not been mounted yet on carriages, but Lexington purchased a pair of cannons from Watertown. So they really carry all that stuff on April 19th, 1775? The answer is a resounding yes. First of all, you had British accounts, and I'll just put this up here. British accounts actually said that the British soldiers that observed the Lexington militia on the green, saw them draw it up prior to the Battle of Lexington in military order, so that means they were following the British manual to the T, with arms and equipment for a campaign. That means cartridge boxes, knapsacks, blankets, canteens, bayonets. They had everything. On top of that, there is actually evidence that the British looted the dead or the wounded after the battle. And they started, the Lexington militiamen would later submit claims to the Massachusetts legislature saying, hey, I got robbed after I was shot or wounded on the Battle of Lexington, and this is what they stole from me. And you can see Lieutenant Tidd, who was wounded at the Battle of Lexington. He had stolen a gun, cartridge box, powder horn, etc. So again, it lines up with what the town was trying to produce. Even for families of the dead, they submitted a joint petition saying, hey, after the person was killed, we had multiple, equipment stolen by British soldiers. And again, you see evidence of bayonets, firearms, powder horns, etc. So real quickly, you have Lexington that's in full wartime preparation. On April 18th, 1775, the plan was basically an attempt to basically break the Massachusetts colonists of their resistance to Crown policy. Parliament and King authorized General Gage to undertake any military operations necessary to get the colony back under control. They were sick of hearing about what the Reverend Clarke was preaching from the pulpit. He was supposed to send warships to the New Hampshire coast, Cape Ann, and to the Massachusetts South and North Shores. He also sent soldiers and loyalists to Middlesex, Essex, and Worcester counties to sort of start mapping out and scout the area for a military operation, as well as sample the political moods and identify potential provincial supply depots. Late winter, early spring of 1775, he started getting pressure from London saying, you need to arrest these leaders who are from the opposition party, but also you need to find out where the weapons are stored and you better seize them. So as a result, he started looking at long-range operations to the town of Worcester. He realized those plans were too risky and would be a disaster. Of course, it did anyways. Instead, he decided to focus on Concord. So as a result, the plan called for approximately 700 men composed of elite grenadier, shock troops, and light infantry, your skirmishers. If I had to, I would probably say your grenadiers today would probably be the equivalent of perhaps your armored division going in or supporting an armored division, and your light infantry would be the equivalent of your rangers. Or even special forces, from several regiments and a company of Marines. So a shout out to the Marines who are here today, to march to Boston under the cover of darkness on April 19th. The plan was a total disaster. Everybody knew what was going on. But the strike force was going to be under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith of the 10th Regiment of Foot. And the plan was you were going to go under the cover of darkness and in secrecy to seize and to destroy all the artillery, ammunition, provisions, tents, small arms, any military stores, whatever. But you will take care that the soldiers do not plunder the inhabitants or hurt private property. Now think about that. The general is issued an order, listen, destroy anything you find it's of military value, do not harm the civilian population, and do not plunder the inhabitants. What is the Reverend Clarke preaching up until this time? The British Army wants to plunder, they want to enslave us, they want to destroy us, they want to do everything horrible. So General Gage is trying to counter that perception that if they are going to launch a military operation, make sure it's a precision strike. And of course, here's the route that they followed. Unfortunately, what happened next is it turned into a massive disaster. So in my final comments before I stop talking and take some questions, so what basically, real quickly, a 30-second summation. When the Lexington Militia took the green that particular day, they fielded on the green for full combat. So when you see, drawings of militiamen just in waistcoats and holding just a gun and no hat and that's it, that's not even remotely what they looked like. They were fully, first of all, most of them wore perhaps their best clothing of the day, that if they were going to go out and meet the British Army, they wanted to at least look proper. And again, for a poor town, they're probably at best wearing middle-class clothing. But on top of that, what happened is you had them wearing full campaign gear. They were wearing knapsacks, blankets, cartridge boxes, carrying bayonets. They were out there to protect the town in the event the crap hit the fan, and to ensure that the British did not plunder their town as well. Of course, when you've got the British Army going through your town, how does this affect the civilian population, the men who did not fight, the women and the children who for over a decade now had been hearing from the Reverend Clarke, as well as now the town political communities, the British government is going to enslave us. They are going to send the British Army into the countryside and conquer us and turn us all into slaves, destroy our homes, burn everything to the ground, do horrible and unspeakable things to the women and kill the men. How does the civilian population react to that? And up until about 4 years ago, it was relatively unknown. And I started a project with Jim Hollister of Minuteman National Park and Ruth Hodges, who lives in Lincoln, who's a historian. And we found that what happened is while the men were preparing for war and actually went to war, there was a massive, massive civilian evacuation, particularly in Lexington. So this is a very short, this could be a whole different topic of another time, but as the Lexington Militia assembled on the Common, the first time they assembled was 1 o'clock in the morning when they got word that the British were mobilizing. Many of the town's civilian population just completely panicked and fled the town. The Reverend William Gordon of Roxbury noted that the people in Lexington, as well as surrounding communities and inhabitants, had left their houses in the general area along the Boston Road, Massachusetts Ave and Route 2A, thinking they were fleeing for their lives, that they were trying to escape this advancing army that was now coming to kill and enslave them. And the most troubling account is later in the morning, some of those residents who had not left or had returned realized, oh no, they're coming back from Concord. They're going to come back from our town again. And that's when the real panic, particularly in Lexington, took place. One evacuee recalled that the roads were clogged with women and children weeping. Many escaped in the woods and fields, while others fled to towns that were not along the battle path. Some sought refuge as far away as Andover and Exeter, New Hampshire, according to the accounts I read. So when news of the advance of the British arrived, and of course this is a misquote, it should be April 19th. The writer, for some reason, said April 18th. Many women and children took refuge, until the struggle of the 19th had passed. And by the time the retreating regulars had passed through Lexington on their way back to Boston, the women and children had been so scattered and dispersed that most of them were away from the combat scenario. You couldn't say that for Menotomy, which is now present-day Arlington, because the combat scenario was hand-to-hand and door-to-door, and many civilians were actually sort of caught in the crossfire. So with that said, we're talking about disappearing twice. I'm sorry. I don't know why it's doing that. There we go. Any questions?
Well, first of all, we'll pause and say, thank you, Alex. That was super.
No problem.
And folks, this was originally scheduled, for the first part of April. And we always schedule a program like this, a Lexington homegrown revolutionary program, right around Patriots Day. But Alex, doesn't matter that you did it in August. It was super.
Thank you. I love talking about this, so thank you so much.
Yeah, really good. Okay, we are ready for questions, and there are two ways that you can ask a question. Click on participants, find your name and raise your hand, or send us a chat message and either give us your question as a chat or just say, I have a question, and we will call on you. All right, we are ready to entertain questions. Okay, Arthur's iPad, let us find you. And I'm unmuting you. Why isn't it showing that I've unmuted you, Arthur's iPad? Jim, will you attempt, please? I'm clicking on unmute, and it doesn't.
Just a second here, Linda.
Okay. Arthur's iPad, can you speak up and tell me if you're unmuted? If not.
I just tried to unmute him as well.
Yeah.
Press on.
Oh, I think he's okay now.
All right.
Okay, Arthur, go ahead, please.
Hi, Arthur.
Hi. Excellent talk.
Well, thank you.
It takes me back to my old flintlock. Hardly. Anyway, the question that arose I've been here almost 50 years, and we used to go down early mornings to watch the reenactment on the green. And there, in the past, there always was a lot of conversation about that first shot that was fired. It was fired beside Buckman Tavern. No one knew for sure really who fired the first shot.
Right.
In your research, did you ever determine who fired that errant first shot?
I have two people that I strongly suspect. On the American side, there are British accounts of a young militiaman who was hopping over a fence and firing at them before firing a second time as he retreated or retired towards the Buckman Tavern. That description matches Solomon Brown, who was 19 years old at the time of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. On the other hand, American forces, in their depositions, their accounts say it sounded like a pistol shot that went off. Well, who would have had pistols back then? Well, mounted officers. And so there is a Lieutenant William Sutherland. Of all the British officers who wrote reports, he really goes out of his way to try and explain things away. I mean, he really goes out of his way to try and cast attention away from him. And so there is this belief among some of us that Sutherland may have been the person who was responsible. So unfortunately, I don't have the answer for you, but I have a theory. It's one of those two gentlemen if I had to narrow it down.
Well, that is fascinating that you could even get that far to identify two possibilities.
Yeah, it took a while. What it came down to was you take a look at the Paul Revere deposition describing a pistol shot going off.
Yeah.
And then there's an account of he's basically describing that it was a mounted officer shooting his pistol. And of course, who's a mounted officer who's near them? One is Pitcairn, but Pitcairn is indicating I didn't fire.
Yeah.
And somebody else, I think, had said Pitcairn wasn't firing. But the next mounted officer is Sutherland, William Sutherland of the 38th Regiment of Foot.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Phil Cunningham has a question.
Sure.
How accurate is the quote attributed to Captain Parker about holding your fire and do not fire unless fired upon?
That is a great question. That quote comes from the 19th century, from the 1820s depositions, the series of depositions that came out. In the 1820s, there became a dispute over who fired the first shot, Lexington or Concord. And so as a result, various historians went about to their various towns and started interviewing veterans, especially Lexington. And there was a quote, I think it's attributed to either Monroe, I think it's quoted to Monroe, William Monroe, who said, Parker said, stand your ground, don't fire unless fire upon. If they have a war, let it begin here. That quote, most historians believe is probably greatly embellished. There is no primary 18th century account of him making that statement, nor would he. The purpose of militia companies and of Minuteman companies on April 19, 1775 was initially a defensive force or a reactionary force. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress had issued orders early on when they started telling militia units gear up for war. The response was, don't provoke them. Do not provoke the British if you can avoid it. We want to be a defensive unit. So you will never find in 18th century documents early on Parker saying, don't fire unless fire upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Do I think he gave some instructions to his men? Absolutely. Although he was not a military veteran, based upon my research, he was a brilliant commander. This guy is the rare example where you have a military unit that was swept from the battlefield and had heavy casualties. He was able to rally the unit with the assistance of the Reverend Clarke and bring them back into combat for the afternoon. So do I think he said something of, warnings and inspiration? I absolutely do. Do I think that phrase came about 40 years after the events? I think there's a little bit of embellishment.
Okay. So Gresh Lattimore has a question.
Sure.
He asks, if the relief column from Boston had not arrived when it did in the afternoon, would this have been the greatest disaster of the British Army in memory? And what might have that precipitated?
Ooh, that is a great question.
I'm so glad we're asking.
I'm going to tell you right now, I'm thrilled at the question you guys are asking, because these are really great questions. I'm now excited. I'm going to blow off work for the rest of the day. We can talk as long as you want. That's a wonderful question. So let's assume Percy's relief column, for whatever reason, didn't arrive. I do not think the column would have made it at the farthest they would have made on the best case scenario is probably the entrance of Menotomy, which is now Arlington, because Menotomy narrows and you have houses that are bordering the property, and they were filled with militiamen. On top of that, you had full militia regiments coming in from Essex County as well as Norfolk County, and Worcester was starting to mobilize. So what would have probably happened is somewhere between Concord Hill in Lexington and, let's just say, what is now the Arlington border, the column probably would have been forced to surrender, or you would have had British troops mutinying at that point. It would have been a massive disaster. At minimum, you probably would have had two scenarios. Scenario number one is General Gage, upon word, once it reaches London, he would have been removed from command, and they would have replaced him with either Burgoyne or Howe or Clinton at that point. And they probably would have either they would have sent some politicians in to try and sue for peace, to try and save the disaster. And I say that because there was a scenario where this happened up in Canada in the 19th century. Of course, they had the hindsight of the American Revolution behind them, where there was a little Lexington-Concord type affair up there, and immediately the Crown sent in politicians and officials to negotiate a resolution. So scenario number one would have been the British would have been forced to surrender, Gage would have been removed from command, and perhaps they would have tried to sue for peace. Scenario number two is they bring in new commanders with a full might of the British Army, full British Navy, and just start trying to lay waste to Massachusetts. The problem is, what would have the Massachusetts colonists done after the surrender of the troops? They probably would have marched on Boston at that point. I think they probably would have laid siege to the town as opposed to trying to force their way in, and you would still have a town under siege. But it would have ended much worse. It would have been considered the worst disaster for the British colony. But at that particular point, it could have resulted in a scenario where we could have ended up like Canada and being a dominion of the Crown today. Food for thought.
Food for thought. Okay, so Jim Ramsey has a question about your personal experience as a Minuteman. You portray, is it a cousin of John Clarke? Jonas Clarke?
Jonas Clarke, who was Jonas Parker, excuse me.
I'm sorry, I said Clarke. I have Jonas Clarke on my mind. Jonas Parker.
Jonas
And
Parker,
the question is, please describe your experience. What's it like to be bayoneted, on the green once a year?
You want my opinion, or do you want my wife's opinion? It's a humbling experience, I will say that. For many, many, many years, I portrayed a gentleman named Samuel Hastings Jr. Samuel Hastings Jr. was 17 at the Battle of Lexington. Now, at that time, when I joined the company, I was 18, so it was perfect for me to portray that individual. And it ended up that I portrayed him up until about, I think I was 40. I'm 49 now. And it was an honor to portray that individual. He was someone who volunteered for the Continental Army, ended up as a lifeguard or a bodyguard for General Charles Lee, was captured and then returned to Lexington, I think in 1778. And due to his release conditions, he couldn't fight the war for the rest of the war. About 5 or 6, 7 years ago, Lexington approached me and asked me if I would take on the role of Jonas Parker. And I was honored. And I did some research on him, and he's a fascinating man. Many people think that he was an elderly gentleman at the time of the battle. He was actually middle-aged. He was about my age. He was about 52. I'm 49. He was 52 at the time of the battle. He made it quite clear. I've seen documentation that he made it quite clear that if there was a battle, he was not retreating from the green, or he was not going to retreat from the British. He was in it for the fight. He had multiple children. Most of them were adult children by the time of the battle, although he did have a special needs child that he was taking care of, and I think she was about 14 to 17 at the time of the battle. He was a carpenter by trade. So when they asked me to take over the role, I had conducted all that research. Well, then came the training for the bayoneting. And I was like, you have to be kidding me. And it turned out the gentleman who bayonets me, the British Grenadier, he and I worked many times together behind the scenes to prepare and practice for the bayoneting. We would get together, 3 or 4 times a year just to make sure we were comfortable. And he was a young gentleman. He was probably about 25 years old. And he came to me and he said, listen, I got married, and, my wife is pregnant now, and she's due to deliver around the battle. So there's a new guy that's coming in. And so the new guy came in, and long story short, I will say this, it's a scary experience being bayoneted. If you do it right with somebody who's professional, you got nothing to worry about. But in this particular case, this person came in kind of acting like a yahoo. His bayonet was supposed to, pretend to come along my side of my torso. He came in low. The bayonet blade actually pierced my breeches or my pants and went through. It could have been a lot worse. It wasn't. And it was a scary experience. I waited about a week before I told my wife because she was not thrilled that I potentially could be bayoneted. And when she found out, because she saw my breeches and there was 2 holes in the pants, one where they entered and one where they exited. I will say this: a bayonet is about a foot long, the blade itself. I'll just leave it at this for the gentlemen in the who have seen the reenactment, see me bayoneted. I am kneeling. When the blade entered, fortunately, all parts are still intact. But it was a scary experience feeling that blade up against my leg. So as a result, I'm still trying to work with His Majesty's 10th Regiment of Foot, which is the British reenactment group, to find a rubber bayonet. But it's a humbling experience to portray that individual. And I find him fascinating up until his death. I keep finding little bits of information about him.
Okay. We have a couple more questions.
Sure.
David Horton is curious. He'd like to know a little bit more about the Reverend Clarke. Specifically, how might the Reverend Clarke be viewed through today's lens?
Ooh.
And was there any opposition to what he preached back in the day?
So I'm going to go in reverse order. There was opposition. Keep in mind that the Reverend Clarke was Congregationalist, still around today. And that was the core New England religion. You had Anglicans in Boston that were preaching in favor of the crown, that were preaching, loyalty to the crown and in opposition to Clarke and his men. There weren't too many Catholics, although the Catholics were loyal to the crown as well, because they, with the Quebec Act from the previous decade, had given them, official recognition, so they didn't have to worry about being persecuted in North America. So you would have the Anglican ministers. There was a small smattering of Congregationalists who were like, whoa, you are way out of control, Reverend Clarke. You need to dial it back. But they were an exception to the rule. It was usually Congregationalists who were preaching sedition. Anglicans were preaching loyalty to the crown. And there is Anglican ministers in Boston and Salem at that time. How would the Reverend Clarke respond today? I always try to make sure my lectures are apolitical. So I'm going to have to say, I don't know. I don't know. On the one hand, he did see mob violence as a useful tool for questioning authority and for questioning, but it came down to economic reasons, not more affecting political change or completely reverting a government to a whole new, brand new system of government from maybe a capitalist society to a socialist society. So I'm not sure how he would react. Even with society back then, where we think they were very individualistic, that's actually a 19th century view of 18th century. There was this social contract that existed amongst the individuals where they were very dependent upon each other to get through the hardships. So I'm gonna take the apolitical approach and say I don't know. There's elements of today that Clarke may line up on both sides, and so that's the best way I can answer. And I do apologize. I wish I could give a better answer.
Okay. So Phil Cunningham read the book April Morning.
Oh, yes.
I'm sure you've read, okay?
Yep.
And there are 2 schools of thought he'd like you to comment on. They have to do with what brought the Minutemen to the green in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So one school of thought is that they were heroes. And they had nothing but noble motives.
Mhm.
They came to the Green to protect their home, their family, truth, justice, and the American way.
Mhm.
The other school of thought is that they were hanging out all night at the Buckman Tavern because they'd been warned, and that they sort of were almost taken by surprise when the British showed up. So they got their act together and moved across the street and, assembled in a hurry. I'm sure the truth is something in between. What is
That-
the real situation?
That would exactly be my answer. The truth is somewhere in between. On the one hand, yes, they were assembling on the Green to protect their town. What I didn't discuss in my lecture, but you had two factors. On the first hand, they were there to protect the town, to make sure, from their perception, the British didn't loot and plunder. They were also on the Green based upon precedent. There were accounts in Salem, accounts in Roxbury, and an account in, I think, Dorchester, where the British Army would go out and march, either on missions of just scouting or just for exercise. And Massachusetts Militia or Minuteman companies would assemble and just watch them from a distance. And when the British would see them, they'd turn around, change their route, or go back. So first it was for protecting the town. The second, logical reason was we're going to be on the Green because we have precedent. We have other communities that have done this. We're going to do the same thing. The third one would be because there is evidence that John Hancock and Sam Adams had just recently, if they hadn't left the town, they were about to leave the town. And so there might have been a delaying factor in their mind as well, because they thought perhaps that this British column was going to arrest these politicians also. Were they caught by surprise? A little bit. There is this belief that while they were in the tavern, they were just doing nothing but drinking away. May have been the case. I definitely, as I had indicated, there was a higher rate of consumption for alcohol in the 18th century as opposed to today. But were they caught by surprise? A little bit. Why? Well, they had sent out 3 alarm riders to go see if the British were on the road. The first 2 came back and said there's nothing out there. The third one came back. It said the British have just crossed from Menotomy into Lexington. They're about a mile to 2 down the road. You need to assemble. So they were a little bit caught by surprise. So with that in mind, they were still prepared for combat. They had a discussion, according to the Reverend Clarke, in a sermon he gave the next year. The discussion before they formed up on the Green is, do we march to Concord? Do we march to another assembly location out of the way of the British, or do we make a stand here on the Green? And I think based upon the precedent that they had from those previous towns that encountered British soldiers, they chose the Green. So the answer is a little bit in the middle.
Okay. I think we have one more question.
Excellent.
And it's the very first one who started us off. It's Arthur's iPad.
Okay,
So Arthur, you have the final question. Go.
I think I must have erred because I do have questions, but I can't think of the one offhand. I must have not muted myself or lowered my hand.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I've lowered your hand for you. So
yeah, well, the Minutemen made mistakes too,
Oh yeah. We could get into that. Just going on the Green itself was probably a mistake, but we could. So, Linda, I just want to share with me, in case you guys ever want to follow me, this is my blog, historicalnerdery.com. That is, I'd say about 80% of my postings are Lexington specific. But I also have publications. I'm going to send you, Linda, this PowerPoint presentation so that you can share all this information. But you can also check out my books on Amazon. That's the short address. And then finally, guys, because I usually run out of lectures with an angry mob chasing me, here's my contact information. Do not be a stranger. If you got any questions, give me a call, shoot me a text message, send me an email. If I do not answer the call, leave me a voicemail. I'll call you as quickly as possible. It could be that my wife, who's 5 feet and I'm afraid of her, is making me mow the lawn. So I don't want to anger her. She's from Quincy. But shoot me an email. I love talking history. Anything I can do to support you guys, I would be more than happy to. And I'm going to stop sharing probably right now.
Okay, well, that was grand. All right. Well, with that, I think we've had another successful afternoon, and this will conclude our August program of the Lexington Veterans. Thank you, everybody, for attending. It was wonderful to see you all again. And we will send you news of our next program in the next couple of weeks. Thank you. See you again.
Thank you so much.
And you too, Alex.
All right. Have a
Bye,
good day.
everybody.
Bye.
Enjoy the rest of the summer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.